Hey guys, it's Cheryl from Woodshop Diaries, and this project has a surprise. In this video, I'll be showing you how I built this Murphy bed cabinet, so if you're ready to dive in and get building, let's go. To get started, I first began cutting down the plywood to build the main cabinet body from. The full cut diagrams are in the printable plans that I've linked below. I cut two side panels from 3/4 inch plywood, and then I cut a large back panel from 1/2 inch plywood. I also cut two 1x3s to run between the side panels. Well, actually, one was a 1x3 and the other was a 3/4 inch plywood strip. The front and top of the side panels will be exposed in the finished project, so I edge banded those pieces, then sanded everything before assembling. I used pocket holes and screws to assemble the cabinet, and I made sure that the solid 1x3 was at the front and the plywood strip was toward the back. Once the cabinet was together, I also added a few screws in the back to secure the back panel to the support strip. Okay, so I'm gonna build the top for this, and the top is gonna be actually in two pieces. I'm gonna cut it and assemble it as one. It's gonna have trim around the sides and the front, and once the trim is dry, I'm gonna rip it down the middle so that the back half will be stationary and the front half will flip over. This is the trim that I got to go around the edge. I'll install it so it's flush across the top, but it'll overhang the bottom, I think about 1/2 inch. I think this is 1.25 inches wide, and then this is 3/4. The very top, so that there's some wiggle room, there's gonna be a gap between the folded in parts and the top of the cabinet. So I'm gonna use this trim to cover that gap. It doesn't have to be any specific trim. You could just use a 1x2 if you wanted to. But I bought this trim. I cut to fit this trim around the sides and the front of my top, then I glued and nailed it in place. I made sure not to nail close to where I was planning to cut this piece in the next step. While the glue dried, I added a support strip between the front and the back of the cabinet, and I had planned to add the bottom panel, but I changed my mind, so we're going to come back to that. I ripped my top panel down the middle, made sure that the pieces would fit on the cabinet, then drilled pocket holes into the side panels to secure the back piece. So the store was out of the size hinge that I needed. These are 2.5 inches wide by 1 3/4, and I really needed like 1.5 because this is 1.5, so it overhangs each side a little bit. Ideally, you would want 1.5 or 1 3/8 or something that's not wider than these two boards, but it is what it is. Now at this point, it makes the most sense to go ahead and install the bottom panel into the cabinet. Please ignore that the door slides are already installed in this part. I actually built this entire project in random order and then took it apart to reassemble it for the video in an order that made more sense. So you'll see this project in various stages throughout the video, just ignore what's out of order in the background. You're probably wondering why this bottom panel is in two pieces, and the reason is simply because if I
had cut it as one solid piece, I would have needed a whole extra sheet of plywood, but I had enough plywood left that I could cut it in 2 pieces, so that's what I did. I installed the 2 bottom panels using pocket holes into the sides and screws through the middle support. And at this point, I wanted to move on to working on the front part of the cabinet.
Okay, so the doors on the front, it's actually gonna be like a one solid piece. It's gonna look like 4 doors, but it's gonna fold down as one whole piece. So the way that I'm gonna build this is I'm gonna use 1x3s for like the top and the outside and the bottom. But for the dividers, like where 2 doors will appear to come together, I'm gonna use a 1x6, and I'm gonna cut like a little curve down the center so it'll look like a gap between the doors.
I cut the 1x6 and some pieces from 1x3s to lay out a frame that would look like 4 individual doors. Then I assembled this frame using pocket holes and screws. I didn't worry that this frame was a bit bowed. It's not finished, so hang tight. Now that the frame was together, I needed to add the backer. For this, I cut a piece of 3/4 inch plywood just slightly narrower than my frame so that the doors would overlay the sides a bit. On that note, this was not my original plan. I had originally designed this project to use a slatted frame for the mattress. These Trifold mattresses come in 4 or 6 inch foam, which is quite thin, and after building a slatted frame, I realized that slats would not properly support the 4-inch foam mattress because it would kind of seep into the gaps and you could feel them when you sat or laid on it. So I decided against a slatted frame and I settled on a thicker, solid plywood backer. I installed 3 butt hinges across one long edge of this panel. Then I glued and clamped the door frame onto the front. Now this part is complete and I set it aside for the moment while I build the second fold-out frame. Had I had enough 3/4 inch plywood left for this part, I would have used it, but I didn't. What I did have was some 1/2 inch plywood. So I grabbed a couple of 1x4s and assembled a frame, then added some 1/2 inch plywood into the openings. I was a bit hesitant about this, so before building the whole thing, I tested that it would hold plenty of weight. Obviously, this was made to support a mattress where the weight will be far more distributed and not concentrated on this one panel, so I felt like if it would hold me bouncing in the middle of it, it should be fine. However, if you wanted, you can grab another 3/4 inch plywood sheet and cut this panel from that instead. This just saved roughly $75 to buy a couple of 1x4s versus a whole 3/4 inch sheet of ply. Next, I needed to build some foldable leg supports for this frame. I needed these to be able to fold in and out, so I attached them with hinges. Now I set this piece aside because before I can install the fold-out parts to the cabinet, I needed to add the drawer. I installed a pair of slides into the bottom section of the cabinet about a 1/2 inch up from the bottom edge. Then I cut down 3/4 inch plywood strips to build the drawer box with. I needed 2 long pieces for the front and back, 2 short pieces for the sides, and a short middle divider. After edge banding the top edges, I assembled this drawer box with wood screws. I cut and screwed a 1/2 inch plywood panel onto the bottom. Then I installed this drawer box onto the slides in the cabinet. Next, I needed to add the drawer front. Similar to the doors, I used a 1x6 in the middle and 1x3s to make a frame that looked like two door fronts. I assembled this with pocket holes and screws, then used a piece of 1/4 inch plywood scrap as a shim to hold it 1/4 inch off the ground as I secured it to the drawer box.
The top of this drawer, it comes to just above the lip of the drawer front. Just enough room we might be able to drive a screw maybe up kind of at an angle, but I'm just gonna focus on securing it in the middle here into the 1x6 and on the ends into these 1x3s vertically.
This drawer is designed to help support the middle fold-out piece, so I used it here to hold it in place while I attached the hinges between the two fold-outs. I installed 3 butt hinges across the joint between the two fold-out frames. Then I attached the hinges that I already added to the middle fold-out to the 1x3 support in the cabinet. I tested it out a bit and made sure that the mattress would fit. Thank goodness it did. Then I decided to move the hinges between the frames a bit closer to the edge to keep the corners from flexing. Bubs was very helpful with this part. The top, when it's down, holds the doors in place, but for just a little extra security, I added a latch on each side to latch the doors closed so that they won't accidentally fold down. And at this point, I sealed the cabinet with a couple coats of Minwax polyacrylic. I didn't like how the legs didn't lock when I folded them out, so I ordered some hinge supports to add to each leg. I'll link the ones that I used here in the video description. They worked great and really helped sturdy up the frame.
Yeah? What do you think? All right, did we go in? Let's go get a snack. What do you think?
At this point, all that was left was adding some knobs to the doors and some drawer pulls to the drawer.
So I wanted to make a couple quick notes here. The drawer box is installed a 1/2 inch off the floor and the drawer front is installed a 1/4 inch off the floor. If you're dealing with carpet, you might consider making the drawer front about a 1/4 inch shorter and installing it 1/2 inch off the floor just to give you a little bit more clearance when you're pulling it out. The second thing is somewhat related. So the drawer slides here are rated for 100-pound weight capacity. Just to be clear, this drawer is really not supporting a lot of the weight that's on the bed. Once it's all folded out, the weight is really on the legs and the front support. The drawer is mostly here to help support this middle piece as you fold it out so that it's not like laying on the floor, it can rest flat on the drawer. But all of that said, there will be a little bit of weight potentially distributed on this drawer front. When you pull it out, like I mentioned, the drawer front should be about a 1/4 inch off the floor. So one idea to just help prevent any issues with the drawer slides if too much weight is applied to it is to use a couple of shims. Paper shims would be better, but I just grabbed a couple of thin strips out of my trash pile and I'll show you what I mean. So once the drawer is out, you can simply slide your 1/4 inch shim underneath the drawer front. So that way when everything's folded out, you're not really putting any pressure on the drawer front or the slides because it's in contact with the floor. Also, when you get ready to put this in, you can just slide these shims right inside the drawer box. One more quick note is when this is folded out, make sure that the locks on the legs are actually locked in.
And with that, this Murphy bed cabinet was finally finished. I'm super excited about how it turned out. It was actually far more challenging to design than it was to build. This would make a great addition to a guest room, and my dad actually suggested hanging a TV above it. Then you can lay on the bed with your head at the foot and watch TV. I hope you enjoyed seeing this project come together, and if you'd like to build your own, I've got the printable plans linked in the video description. There's so many more fun projects to come soon, so be sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss them. Thanks so much for watching, friends, and until next time, happy building!